You're listening to What's the Story, the official historical podcast of World of Tanks North America. Each episode, we dive into a tank-related topic with our host, Nicholas the Chieftain Moran.
After Operation Chromite, the landing at Incheon, arguably the next most commonly known operation of the Korean War is Ripper, and this is mainly because of the colourful markings which a number of units placed on their tanks, such as found on the M46KR in our game, World of Tanks. I'll come back to the Tiger markings on the tanks later. Ripper, though successful, cannot be taken in isolation however, and was in actuality something of a continuation of the previous operation, which had the decidedly unoriginal name of Operation Killer. For that to be placed in context, one needs to look at the defense of the Wonju line, and specifically the Battle of Chipyong-ni on 17th of February 1951. This was the high watermark of the Chinese offensive. It's located more or less right in the center of the peninsula, east-southeast of Seoul. American and French forces in particular not only finally brought the Chinese advance to a halt, but also started to drive them northward a bit. This thus set the stage for a new counterattack by Ridgway's forces. This would be Operation Killer. The intent was to retake the initiative and deny the enemy forces the chance to consolidate and refit. The pattern of the previous few months was that any Chinese unit would attack for about a week before needing to pause. The force around Wonju and Chipyong-ni having been on the offense for about a week at that point. This time though, Ridgway felt that his forces had recovered from their shock and were in a condition to retake the offense. To be fair, Killer was not the first offensive operation ordered by Ridgway, being preceded by Thunderbolt and Roundup, but they were more limited operations in scope. This would thus be his first major offensive operation. He had only taken over from Walker just before Christmas, the latter having been killed in an automobile accident. The paratrooper officer had been given fair latitude by his boss, MacArthur, to attack or defend as he saw fit. Interestingly, the folks in DC were not too enamored of the name Killer for the operation, saying it was a little bit difficult for the public relations guys to work with. Ridgway didn't care, he figured it described the intent pretty well, so he kept it. The intent was to drive north by 9 and 10 Corps to clear all enemy from an area of land east of the Han River, north of Wonju and south of a line named Arizona. For a large offensive, it was still quite cautious, as Intel had identified 7 new armies entering Korea and heading south. Intel had also identified a number of forces in the vicinity of Ripper, but Intel could not tell Ridgway with any particular certainty as to where they actually were. As a result, he had to honor the threat that they very well could end up meeting his offensive or counterattacking. The operation was launched 21st February, and just as well the offensive wasn't too ambitious because it immediately got off to a slow start. The weather, which had basically never gone above freezing for the entire month of February, suddenly warmed and rarely dipped below freezing. Combined with a lot of rain, the result was melting snow which fed rivers, washed away bridges, made fords impassable, and turned roads to mud. Logistical needs were met by the use of airdrops, while engineers fixed the roads and bridges. All in all, it took about 2 weeks to move the distance from the start line to Arizona, an average of 10 to 15 miles. Though certainly thousands of enemy were killed, the goal of destroying large enemy forces was not achieved for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the Chinese had already started withdrawing for a couple of days by the time Killer started, and their first few days were in better weather conditions. Secondly, the Chinese did not offer no resistance at all. They fought some fairly determined rearguard actions with smaller units. They may have been lost, but they did buy time. This left Ridgway with some choices. His primary goal was still the destruction of enemy forces. He was quite specific that the terrain would just be a tool for the job, and there were still plenty of enemy forces out there which had escaped his Killer advance. Being now a little further up the Han's far bank though, it did offer the possibility of a left hook around Seoul, either isolating enemy forces there, or forcing them to abandon the city, lest they be cut off. Further, intelligence had started to track down some of the missing enemy units, and it seemed that they were still not ready to take an offensive, especially since the UN air forces had paid particular attention to their lines of communication and railway bridges. Demonstrations were also being made by the UN amphibious forces on the coasts, and of course the success of the Incheon landing would have been well in the minds of enemy leadership, so the Chinese and North Korean defensive assets had to honor multiple threats. The timing was set by the supply situation. Ridgway had already figured on Ripper before Killer had reached its conclusion, but supplies were limited for 3 reasons. Firstly, the logistical branches were still a little bit reluctant to have large supply stocks far forward, given the past recent history of falling back south from the Yalu. There was too much risk of them being captured by the enemy or just destroyed in place by retreating Americans. Secondly, the roads and railways were still not fixed from their damage caused by the thaw and rains. And thirdly, of course, the UN had just completed a multi-corps offensive, which used up what supplies were present. Thus there was a delay while the required 5 days' worth of supplies were brought forward. Operation Ripper launched on 7th of March. This time, Ridgway politely asked MacArthur to not hold a press conference until after the attack was launched. MacArthur had a habit of flying in just before an attack. Ripper was a slightly more ambitious plan, with the final line, called Idaho, up to 30 miles beyond the positions then held. It was believed that in this area should be found a reasonable concentration of enemy forces not ready for full combat, and also enemy supply facilities. Initially, Ripper proceeded satisfactorily. The hand was crossed, and the first day gains of 1 or 2 miles followed. The enemy would more often than not just put up a token resistance and then withdraw, but some rearguard units did fight harder. Of course, any intelligence report is stated with caveats such as "we believe" and "we template," because they are only estimations. This time, the intel folks were somewhat off the mark with regards both enemy composition and intentions. The Chinese forces coming south were in fact North Korean, returning to the peninsula after refitting. Additional Chinese forces were behind them. This meant that the enemy plan was to launch an attack somewhat later than 8th Army intelligence believed, which also meant that they were less suited to hold the line as it was. This would have some pretty significant knock-on effects, as the North Korean and Chinese forces chose to withdraw for time instead of fight where they were. Over the coming days, units reached their first phase line and replenished. Things seemed to be going well enough that Ridgway instructed the next phase to occur the morning of 14th of March. Units advanced against, in many cases, no opposition. The enemy had already withdrawn. Such was also to be the case outside of the Ripper area of operations. You will recall I had mentioned that one of the goals of Ripper was to threaten to isolate North Korean or Chinese forces in Seoul. It would seem that the northern forces were not going to give the United Nations that opportunity. After air reports indicated troops moving north from the banks of the Han, Korean and Belgian forces cautiously crossed on the evening of the 12th to have a look-see. They found nothing, and more forces moved over. The 14th and 15th, troops entered Seoul itself, and found nothing. The enemy had apparently moved to a defensive line about 5 miles north of the city. Back in the Ripper AO, the next advance was initially quick, then there was 1 day of solid rearguard action by the enemy the 15th, before they withdrew north again. As a result, Ripper proved to be more a symbolic than an actual success. There was no great destruction of the enemy force as intended. Few supply points were captured. Indeed, the North Korean 10th Division, which had been trapped behind the front line in tough terrain during Killer, made an effort to return to the North Korean lines, and despite a 10-day effort by the South Koreans, half of the estimated 2,000 or so soldiers escaped, so even the one trapped unit was not destroyed in the manner expected by the operation. On the other hand, the capital city was again recaptured, and most importantly, the political leadership in DC, which was considering a proposal for a truce, had decided to wait and see what the results were after Ripper before actually moving forward with it, under the premise that the Chinese and North Koreans would be more inclined to accept after suffering a major loss of forces. This, of course, resulted in the significant conflict with MacArthur, after which President Truman felt he had no choice but to relieve him. not that it was the first time that they had clashed. MacArthur was of the opinion that if you're going to fight a war, don't limit yourself. Worse, after assuring Truman that the Chinese would not attack across the Yalu, and thus getting permission to advance northwards, his movement triggered the Chinese attack and so lengthened the war and grossly increased the human cost. Now, not only had MacArthur's comments undermined Truman's position vis-à-vis the other allies in the UN, who Truman had to sound the truce concept with, but they got to the stage that Truman considered MacArthur's public actions and statements as rank insubordination. In the end, both careers were torpedoed. MacArthur's military career was over, but he was so popular with the American people that when news of MacArthur's firing reached the US population, Truman's popularity dropped to a record low never since reached, 22% approval rating. How could you approve of the man who fired the liberator of the Philippines, the executor of the dramatically successful Incheon landing to save Korea? Truman didn't even try to run for office again. On the other hand, the incident did serve as a reminder of the supremacy of civilian leadership over the military. Interestingly, though MacArthur did consider a run for president, as more details came out over just what had happened behind the scenes, his light faded, and thus attention moved to another five-star general, Eisenhower. However, this is all an aside. The decision made to try to seek terms, there would only be limited additional movement. The follow-on operation from Ripper was courageous, which involved an airdrop to block the exit of North Korean forces along the western coast of the peninsula, whilst ground forces would move north to eliminate them. But again, the North's forces had withdrawn faster than the UN's forces could move. Only limited success came from that operation. Two smaller operations would come afterwards, but then the long-expected Chinese counteroffensive hit, which is another story. So that's the general story of Ripper. What's the association with that and the various paint schemes sported by the tanks? Multiple units applied them, from M46s and M4s with full-on tiger claws, to others with just faces with claws and teeth. Even a unit of M24 Chaffies sported yellow and black fronts with a gaping maw. It was simply a coincidence, a matter of timing. Some months before, with the Chinese People's Volunteers swarming south into the peninsula, someone in the US Army's Psychological Operations Division copped to the fact that 1950-51 was the year of the metal tiger in the Chinese zodiac. Maybe painting the tanks up like metal tigers would have a psychological effect on the less than literate Chinese soldiers doing the fighting. Obviously, this idea met with official approval, and the word was sent downrange to paint up the tanks. And by the time this was done in the majority of the units, it was time for Ripper. There is a catch. By the time of Killer and Ripper, the calendar had changed to the year of the rabbit. However, it is not often that one gets official sanction to paint up a tank. Normally, they tend to be fairly dull colors, not least because you don't want to draw attention to yourself. But the UN forces had attained such a level of tank superiority it didn't really matter either way. As a result, even if there was no actual effect on the other end, it is doubtless that there was a positive morale effect on the US troops as they scrounged yellow, orange, or red paint from whatever back corners of the supply system in order to customize their mounts, and thus provide us with a number of cool photos of the vehicles that we can make models of. So that's Ripper. This was a shorter episode than most, so hopefully you didn't have too bad a commute and you don't have too much further to go. I'll be back for the next episode of What's the Story?
Thanks for listening to What's the Story? Subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform or listen to us on YouTube at youtube.com/World of Tanks NA. Visit worldoftanks.com to sign up to play World of Tanks or dive into more historical videos, podcasts, and articles.